Hello and welcome back to another interview with the composer. Today we have Mikko Tammia. I hope I pronounced that right.
Yeah,
Yeah, great stuff.
that's close
And
enough.
he's the composer of a very popular game series, Amnesia, and he works for Frictional Games. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm just fine.
Good.
Just looking outside, it's raining here in eastern Finland, and
Okay.
we don't have any snow yet, but I hope it will come soon. It's much better than the rain we have now.
It rains a lot here as well. So could you please tell us how you got started composing music?
Yes, sir. I started making music like 30 years ago when I was a 12 years old kid, and I copied this tracker program for Amiga called Pro Tracker from a friend, and that's the way I got interested in making music. Well, then I followed the techno scene, which was kind of new back then, before it was more commercial. And I tried to make techno music and tried to even get a recording deal, but it didn't happen. And
Sure.
then I moved on and got interested in playing instruments and trying to do some orchestral music. And that was something I was studying by myself, not learning the instruments. I took some courses, and I've been a gamer since I was a little kid, and I thought that it would be kind of cool to make music for games. And my first try was in the end of the 90s. I tried to get my music for an Amiga game because I was still using Amiga, and I was following that scene. But I got rejected, and I then just continued studying the orchestration. And I think the big step was to move from Amiga and buy a Mac. And then I tried different programs, and I found Logic. You move on because I was having all my orchestral instruments as a sound modules. They're like a really bad, a lot of samplets compressed into tiny space,
Yeah, sure.
like memory wise. And then I got the Mac, and the quality of my music busted up real fast. Like it started to sound like something. And well, then I was a Mac boy then. I was an Amiga boy in the 90s, but I was a Mac boy then, and I checked what's happening in Mac scene. And Mac wasn't like the PC. There wasn't that much games around like nowadays. And then I just was watching a developers forum, and I noticed there's not much happening, not much composers offering their music. And I thought I just posted my message there saying that I'd be really interested in trying to compose music for games, and contact me if you're interested. And I got contacted by this Mac developer CodeBlender software. And I was lucky that way that my first game was commercially released. Like it was just a hobby project. Like most of them are. Or I did music for some hobby projects, but they were never finished. Like that was the risk with the.
Yeah. How did you come to work for Frictional Games?
I've had some luck on my way, because when I was working for CodeBlender software, I did like 4 games for them, and then they hired a sound designer for one of their games, and this sound designer was Jens Nilsson, who was the co-founder of Frictional Games, and he then asked me if I could do some music for the tech demo for Penumbra, which was a tech demo. I did a couple of songs, and the tech demo was well received in the audience, and Frictional Games decided to make Penumbra commercial game, and I was included at that point. And been ever since that. Well, like a Soma Amnesia Rebirth, it's 5 years of work for the studio. So that's only a little amount of time what they need a composer for. I'm on board from the start, but I do some work here and there, and it's I think it's not even a few months of work I've done for this project together.
So if you don't mind me asking, like what kind of projects do you do in between when there's nothing really to work on?
Yeah, but the thing is, I'm not a full-time composer. I've had my daytime job. I've always had, because I think you would have noticed if I was full-time, my credits list would be much longer. So I'm doing this at my free time.
Okay, sure. So let's talk a bit about Amnesia: The Dark Descent. It became an extremely popular game for streamers and YouTubers, to do streams and stuff. How do you feel about the way that many people experienced the game for the first time? Do you find that's a good thing or a bad thing?
Of course, it's a good thing. There's the frictional games was at the point that if Amnesia: The Dark Descent, if it would fail, then it would be the end for frictional games, perhaps. And it was released at the perfect time, because there wasn't that much that kind of survival horror games at the market at that point. And Penumbra was kind of surviving without any weapons.
So compared to Dark Descent, Soma was more of a story-driven game, you would say. How did you approach that in terms of songwriting and composition?
The one thing was that the budget for music for Amnesia: The Dark Descent was very limited. So I had to compose music within that budget. I had to do short loops for background music, and of course my orchestration was limited because we decided we only used the instruments that existed in that era. Story is based on it, so I was processing these sounds and trying to make weird sounds out of normal instruments. And Soma was a really different kind of project because, for instance, it was larger in the scale of the environment. Also, it's not just a Penenburg castle where you're isolated in, but it was a underwater world, and so there was many more places to examine and to explore. And I was more doing more sound designing stuff, for that game. Every sound has to be designed from scratch almost. So it was very different kind of an approach for me.
So yeah, I didn't know that about Amnesia: The Dark Descent. Did you use a lot of samples, or did you actually try and use a lot of the actual instruments and record them yourself?
Yeah, I used I'm a bassoon player, the big woodwind instruments look like a big baseball bat, but I utilized that for the Guardian sound.
Yeah,
it might be maybe the most famous sound from the what I've done, but most of them was samples.
So moving on to Amnesia Rebirth, which has just come out this week. Been playing it all day today, pretty much. Did you find yourself using similar stuff that you'd learned from Soma, or did you kind of go back to the style of more Amnesia to fit in with the series?
I think it was a mix of them, because I don't want to give too much spoilers here if somebody hasn't played the game yet, but Rebirth's story is related to the Dark Descent story. I also utilized my previous music from Dark Descent, some of the same sounds at some spots, but it had more similar approach to what I had for Soma. story-wise, because it's much more story-oriented game. The story is in much bigger role, perhaps, and there's much more emotions in this game. For Rebirth, I utilized more like real instruments, but also samples.
Did you find you wanted to do sort of more ambient stuff rather than maybe leading the player in an emotional sense? Sort of, this is what emotion I want you to feel. Did you find you wanted to do it a bit more subdued?
No. I think there's a place for them both. Like there's need for ambient music, of course, but like I was working with audio lead Mike Benson, and they knew what kind of emotions they wanted for different events and cutscenes, and that's where the music gets more maybe loud, maybe more noticeable, apart from the rest of the audio, like because that's very important thing in the game. That's the kind of music that accompanies the story.
Amnesia Rebirth is set around an area of like the Sahara Desert. So I was wondering if you considered incorporating like African instruments in there, or have you done that for some of the music?
Yeah, but I wasn't like there's too much cliche from African music. Everybody thinks it's like a maybe Egyptian music, like a pharaoh theme. But I was like using what I had, like a bassoon and flutes and the zither instruments we have in kantele called in Finland, and guitar also, and all kinds of instruments.
Which kind of moments do you think in composing is better to kind of leave silence rather than trying to fill the scene with music?
That's a good question. Like there should be some contrast in the audio as well. Sometimes it's much better if you had like a real chase scene. After that, you should maybe calm it down. Maybe with no music at all, or then set something very subtle music.
Yeah. Going back to Soma again, because you mentioned that you were trying to get into like techno music and stuff like that. Did you find that a comfortable fit to sort of slide into that sort of more futuristic style that it has?
Well, because
technological style.
Yeah, that was far more difficult, because then I had no limited set of instruments. I had like everything, because you can do so much with synthesizers, and it was much more work designing sounds with synthesized sounds, like synthesizer sounds.
Sure.
So it was like my work was like 70 or 80% designing sounds, and the rest was composing.
Okay. Sure. So do you have like a formula that you stick to whenever you're composing that helps you get along, or?
Well, of course, themes, where you do themes and thematic material. And it's something that's good to spread around the game in some way. Like in Rebirth, there's this lullaby, the Hush Hush Baby lullaby, which is like a traditional song. And I was like thinking what kind of music I can make with that. Like it's a happy, like a kind of happy song. So putting that into horror game in some form was like I had to scratch my head out. But then I decided it's the music for Rebirth is like a play with thirds, the minor third or major third, like a musical interval, and that's the like a motive for the game.
So like going back to Penumbra, for instance, did you have like a theme or several themes for that?
Yeah, Jesus, it's been like 14 years since
Okay. Yeah, maybe difficult.
Yeah, but I think I had some themes for that. Yeah,
sure,
for sure. But at that point, when I was doing music for Penumbra, I had no experience at all from sound designing. Like that was the first horror game I ever made, and I haven't had done anything like that before, and so it was a new playground for me.
Sure. Yeah, speaking of horror, the majority of projects you've worked on have been in the horror genre. Is that something you're happy to continue with, or do you kind of want to branch out?
Well, kinda like I really do like a horror, but I noticed that but if somebody was asked for me for the project, it's a horror project.
Yeah, because I know you have a record label. Is there any particular reason you set up the record label to release music?
It's not like a real record label. It's like a channel to distribute my music.
But did you envision yourself releasing sort of different kinds of music on that, or is it that just for games you've worked on?
Yeah, because the first project I made for this label was Aika. It was like a this short story, music around short story, made by Tom Joubert, who was the writer for Penumbra and other games as well. And so that was the first project for the label. And yeah, I have I haven't had that much time, but I'm working on my music of my own. There will be ambient album coming out at some point.
So we can expect to see that on the Bandcamp then when that comes out?
Yeah.
Yeah, great.
Certainly, yeah.
So you also fairly recently worked on a short film, Darkness Finds the Fear. Was that a different kind of experience to working on games?
No, not really, because the games nowadays have lots of cutscenes, and it's like making music for movies.
Yeah.
And I had some movie production experience before, like from amateur films.
Yeah, I did notice you've had quite a few films on there when I was looking at your IMDb page.
Yeah, just a few Finnish indie films.
Sure. What advice would you give to aspiring composers?
Well, that's a good point. And maybe I was like, if you start from nothing, you really need to develop your connections to get your network. It's really good to know people from the field, which is not easy because maybe there are some events at some in Finland. I heard there's these events in Helsinki where all kinds of developers get connected together and maybe drink some beer and have fun together, and that's one way to maybe connect them. But otherwise, it was for me back in the day, it was like I was trying to email every company and try to ask if they need any music, and all the answers were no. We already have a musician.
I've tried that as well in the past. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and I think the competition is tough nowadays. There's like a developers forums, and they're full of composers.
There's probably as many composers as there are developers.
Yeah, maybe more, even more. Like I did, you should really study music, not just one style, but be open and try to make music in different styles.
Yeah.
Study composing styles, because that really helps when getting jobs.
Okay, that's great. That makes sense. Okay, thank you very much for talking with me today. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for having me in this interview.
Check out Mikko Taimio on his Bandcamp or his website. I'll leave the links in the description below. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see ya.
Yeah, thanks. See ya.
Cheers.